Greedflation.
Oh, God.
The notion that corporate price gouging is helping to keep inflation robust at a time when commodity prices have actually fallen over the past 12 months. Now, to me, they undercut their whole idea right there because they're blaming corporations raising their prices, and then they say that actually commodity prices like oil has gone down like 40% since the peaks. Why? Why did that happen? Did we pass a law outlawing greed? I missed that one, but did we do that?
For commodity companies?
Yeah, for just worldwide commodity company law was passed to get oil to drop from 130 down to 66 early last week. Number one, I'll tell you before we get into that, the Fed can't do anything about corporate profits. We allow people to make profits. And all of these arguments revolve around the idea that you would somehow set a law at what percentage profit you could make on a given item, which would be called cost plus, basically, which is why things in the government cost way too much money.
Yeah.
Because they would have every incentive to just not care what the cost of everything is.
That's how you get $1,200 toilet seats and $1,500 coffee mugs.
All right. Quote, the primary driver of this inflation cycle is soaring profit margins. Corporations are raising prices of goods and services not because they need to, due to rising labor and raw material costs, but because they can get away with it by blaming inflation. They include this graph of corporate profits over time since like 1950 and how much they've gone up. Now, the graph they included is total corporate profits over that time, meaning it doesn't account for the number of businesses or what the GDP is increasing over that time or anything like that, just the total amount of money that corporations are profiting. Just since like doesn't matter that if you just went down to the list of things we had in 1950, it would be a very, very, very small portion of the things that we have right now. So maybe that could account for some of the extra money. Blaming wage growth for inflation seems particularly misguided considering that workers' wages haven't even kept pace with rising consumer prices, Edwards said. They said that the wages haven't kept pace. Now, here's something else that hasn't kept pace. The CPI, which is the amount more that we're all paying for stuff, has not kept pace with the producer price index over this time. Charlie, what's the increase for the producer price index since the time that we're pulling from?
Looks 20.99%.
Okay, and what's the CPI?
17.34%.
Okay, so the actual prices for producers still gone up more than the prices for consumers, not included or discussed one single time inside of this Market Watch article.
Corporations are actually losing money, by the way.
They could have raised prices if they would have raised them commensurate with their own inflation, then things would have gone way worse. Corporate profit margins have climbed to near record highs.
Go back to that last chart.
Yeah, profits for non-financial companies rose to nearly $2.1 trillion in the third quarter, a record high on the nominal basis, according to the chart that we talked about earlier. While workers' earnings have generally increased, they haven't kept pace. Average hourly earnings increased by 4.6%. Edwards pointed out that if wages truly are driving the inflation, then the cost of food at restaurants should be rising faster than the cost of food consumed at home, because of the cost of labor. So the price of food at restaurants has not gone up as the price of food that you eat at home. And they say, well, that's proof that the wages aren't the thing that are causing the prices to go up. Like there are no wages included in the price of the food that you eat at home, number one. Two, restaurants have had to try and get customers back inside the door after this little COVID shutdown thing.
Forced to shut down.
Yeah. And so, no, they haven't raised their prices as much as people eating at home, which is what everyone switched to doing during the COVID pandemic. But then they use that to say, well, it's not the wages because the price of eating at home have gone up more than the price of the restaurants. Therefore, wages are not the problem. And that's literally the end of the article, just by using that restaurant idea that you can easily debunk in 2 seconds. Now, the other thing, this chart that we have up right now.
Well, he said it, though. Wages are not the problem. They're not all the problem. There's other factors.
Sure.
It's mostly the devaluing of the dollar by the Fed printing money. Let me show
you some charts here.
It's really the biggest contributor.
Now, here's an interesting thing. They talk about the corporate profit margins going up to near record highs. Now, during that time, by the way, the profit margin over the last few years went from 14% up to 16%. I believe, is what we're looking at right now. Okay. Yeah, we don't like that. Now, I looked at another time when corporate profit margins jumped up way more, and that was between 2000 and 2010, specifically from 2002 to 2007. During that time, corporate profit margins increased by almost 60% during that time. But our inflation only went from 2% to 3.8% during that time. The margins went up by almost 60%, but we didn't get the inflation. Okay, so that's weird, right? Why didn't that happen? This time, the corporate profit margins increased by 15% over the span of a few years, but we went all the way up to 9.1% inflation. Okay, but we're blaming the corporate profit margins. Now, Charlie mentioned the actual money supply. This is another interesting thing. From 2002 to 2007, the orange line is our GDP and the white line is our money supply. They're almost exactly the same, okay? During that period where corporate profit margins increased by 60%, inflation barely went up during that time. The GDP and the money supply went up by basically the same amount. Now, the orange line is the GDP, the white line is the money supply. What's the increase on the GDP there?
9%.
9%, and the money supply?
41%.
And now we end up to we get to a time where we spiked up to a 9.1% CPI. Corporate profit margins went up by 15%, to not 15 like real percent, not like from 15 to 30. It went from 14 to 16. I would like to enter into evidence. Exhibit M2. All right. M2 to GDP is what I would like a respectable publication talking about economics to enter into the conversation the amount that our money supply increased during this time. Because you can look at other times throughout history when the margins went up way more and we did not get the inflation. I just think it's weird.
That's probably another coincidence, Nate.